now. Hold on 1 second. And I hope that that is recording to the cloud. So a second trend that the pandemic has definitely exacerbated is what we'll call unbundling. And again, that's a term by my colleague, Rabbi Kallah, co-president of Kallah. And it's this idea, you know, everyone's sort of cutting the cord. You used to get a big cable package from one provider, and now maybe you just have a Netflix subscription, or maybe, you know, or just the idea, like, I don't want to pay $80 or $100 for 150 channels when I only really watch 5 of them. And so there's a trend, as you may know, of parsing that out, of saying, oh, I just, you know, all I have is Netflix and I pay $15 a month for that. And then I get my entertainment through YouTube or different things on my computer. That actually applies to religion as well, that religion is becoming unbundled, by which I mean that the things that we once offered in the religious world as a package deal, like prayer, spirituality, community, partnership, bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, funerals, entertainment, education. You know, these are all components of what synagogues do. But today, and over the last number of years, people are disintermediating those. I only want this and not this. So why am I going to pay the package deal, so to speak? Right? They may get their spiritual connection from their yoga class, their Jewish learning from a podcast, their community from their Peloton group, right? That there are ways that people are seeking out the functions synagogues used to provide them altogether. They're seeking them out and finding them in a variety of different places. They no longer need just the synagogue to be able to do that. Of course, one component of that is a success, right? That Jews are integrated into society so that we can participate in all different kinds of things. Maybe, you know, 100 years ago, 70 years ago, the synagogue was the center of Jews' social and political and spiritual and relational life, because it wasn't necessarily true that the rest of society was available to synagogue members being Jewish. So there's also a component of this, you know, people embracing the fact that they have multiple identities. I'm a runner, and I'm a Jew, and I'm a parent, and and I'm any one of these things, and they might find community in a variety of different ways. And so it's no longer true that for Jews, it's no longer true that Jews only spend their days connecting with their Jewish identity. There are many other components of our lives that also maybe come with communities. And so how did the pandemic connect with this part? Well, obviously, when buildings are closed and we can't meet in person, we're forced to offer Jewish life, mostly virtually, for quite a long time. And that made those smaller bits of Jewish communal life more available to individuals to experience. And what used to have continuity, in other words, what used to be part of, you know, I'm a Holy Blossom member, I'm a Beth Tzedek member, I'm a member of the Narayever, you know, we used to have, okay, and so I'm going to go to this or this Narayever event, this or this Holy Blossom event. Now people can attend high holidays in New York City from the comfort of their own home. They can, you know, do a Jewish learning podcast that's coming out of Los Angeles or out of Vancouver, right? So in other words, the way that the pandemic made Jewish life much more available electronically has kind of expedited that bit about picking off different pieces and experiencing them individually instead of as part of one whole communal experience. The third thing I want to mention is a sort of mistrust of authority and of religion and of God, various ways that plays out. Over the last 2 decades, there's been an erosion in trust for authority of a variety of kinds. Some of the components of that, just briefly, you know, 9/11 was an act of religious extremism, and people, left that experience wondering, well, if this is what religion does, I don't know that I really want to be part of that. In the U.S. politically, you know, the war that followed was based on false assertions of there being weapons of mass destruction. So that, again, an erosion of trust in politicians. The 2008 economic crisis, an erosion of trust in financial institutions. And for the Catholic Church, right, we saw not only reckonings around the toleration of sexual abuse, but also the continual uncovering of the horrifying behaviors at residential schools. Canadians are actually more likely to trust individuals over institutions by 2 to 1. So they lean toward trusting reformers versus preservers of the status quo. They seem to trust leaked information over company press releases. This is from a trust index. This is from sort of sociological research. And only 29% of Canadians have a high level of confidence in religious leaders. Only 29% overall. And even those who embrace religion, who would identify as embracing religion, only 61% have confidence in religious leaders. So what we're seeing is, this a tendency to distrust people in positions of authority. The 2022 Proof Strategies Trust Index investigated this again right now that we're sort of, God willing, coming out of the pandemic. It found that medical professionals and science professionals still have a high level of trust from the public, but that 45% trusted media, advocacy groups, business, and governments in 2018, and now it is 34%. Right, so we're seeing over time the drop, even just through the pandemic, of trust in some of the people and some of the institutions that have been guiding society through the pandemic. And then finally, financial instability. Younger generations are downwardly mobile, as I'm sure you know. You might have seen that over 40% of Ontario parents whose adult children bought houses recently. Over 40% of their parents had helped them financially to buy that house. And I'm sure you know, wage increases haven't kept up with inflation, right? So there's a financial piece of this which has directly impacted synagogue and Jewish communities. Of course, it's not all bad news. There's some very positive trends coming out of the pandemic as well. So even before the pandemic, it was clear that being connected to religious community has real concrete benefits that make us better people. Those of us who might not better than other people, but like we actually see improvements in our own lives. So religious life seems to increase longevity by between 4 to 10 years, seems to protect against depression. Spiritual teens are 20% less likely to report that they are depressed. Of course, these are correlation, not necessarily causation. So it doesn't mean that if you go to synagogue, all of these things will be true, but rather just happens to be that those who participate in faith community see benefits, an increase in charitable giving, interpersonal generosity. People seem to have a much deeper sense of ultimate meaning in their lives. And I think that what has come out of the pandemic is a new appreciation for that positive impact of being part of faith communities. There was a study that came out just this week from the Federation of New York City area that found that involvement in Jewish community helped people through the pandemic, that there were high levels of anxiety and depression for sure during this time, and that those were much lower for people who are connected to Jewish community. The more frequently people attended Jewish programs, the less likely they were to experience social isolation. 63% of people who never attend synagogue felt socially isolated during the pandemic, compared to 28% of people who had some kind of regular attendance in faith in synagogue life. And that spreads across the board, all sorts of different things in there. One thing that I related very deeply to was that in the age cohort in which Jewish adults are most likely to have young children at home during the pandemic, that was the age cohort most likely to report that being Jewish significantly helped them cope during a crisis. And that was 43% of those folks felt that their Jewish identity and connection helped them cope during a crisis. People also felt increased spirituality. The Pew study in America, 7% of American Jews reported feeling increased faith during the pandemic. And 10% of Jews, at least this was during the first part of the pandemic when the study was done, 10% of American Jews intend to increase their attendance at services after the pandemic. Now, 3% said they would go less. That's still a net of 7% though, right? And when you apply 7% to the total number of Jews in Canada, for example, that's potentially, 40,000, 35,000 Jews that intend to attend synagogue more often. So one of the questions we have to ask too is, are we ready to welcome them? Are we ready to learn their yard sites? Are we ready to learn their Hebrew names? Are we ready to help people navigate our synagogue communities who maybe have not been people who attend previously? So those are some of the bright spots, some of the positive things as well that have been happening during the pandemic. So just to give us a little introduction, a little stage setting, that a lot of things are in flux right now. So we're going to jump a little bit into some conversation for me and Rabbi Splansky. And I think maybe we'll open, after we discuss each question a little bit, maybe we'll open to you and what you think as we go through. So, so maybe I'll ask both of us, Rabbi Splansky. So as I was talking about before, people have the ability to attend services virtually at any synagogue really around the world. It's only limited by when you are awake in your time zone, right? And many Jews have actually taken that opportunity to try new shul, see what else is out there. In that New York City study I mentioned, almost 6 in 10 synagogue members have attended religious services at a synagogue other than their own during the pandemic. So there have been a lot of people exploring, now that they can a little more, what else is out there. And that kind of synagogue switching and exploring has been more common among younger Jews. 74% of Jewish adults aged 18 to 34, and 65% of Jewish adults 35 to 49 have attended services during the pandemic at a synagogue that wasn't their own. Again, these are New York City statistics, but they give us some sense of what's been going on. So I'm wondering, Rabbi Splansky, for you and for and maybe for the group, given that people now have the ability to, attend services anywhere, and of course, we know religious services, prayer services are only one component of what a synagogue community is. I'm wondering what you think about the value, like what is the remaining value of local synagogue community, of having one place that's really the place you belong. Rabbi Splansky, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that, and I can jump in and we can kind of open it up for some conversation too.
Yes, I'm looking forward to hearing what those who are with us have to say on this. A lot of community leaders are with us for this session, so they bring their unique insight. I will say, in my opinion, it's really apples and oranges. I think it's terrific to go and shul hop online and see what's out there, and bring back ideas. And if I could do that even locally in person, I would. I know some rabbis really make that a practice to say once a month, I'm not going to go to my own shul, I'm going to go to some other place and see what's happening elsewhere. So I think that's terrific. I really do. And there's a lot to be gained and a lot to be learned. At the same time, I think it's a totally different experience. It's a totally different category. It's not community. If it isn't already your community. If it's already your community and you're there online, then there are relationships that can be reinforced. But if you're coming new, it's very rare that real relationships can develop online just by clicking. That's my experience. So why would anyone go to shul? I think as soon as you feel comfortable and confident that it's a healthy decision to do, I think it's in its own category. We go to take inspiration from one another. We go to look for role models about how to do Jewish, how to do any mitzvah of any kind. It could be, around refugee relief now, right? As an individual Jew, unaffiliated, I might write a little check. But if I belong to a synagogue that has a whole initiative around refugee relief, I'm much more likely to get in that mitzvah game, like all in, not just writing a check, but actually sponsoring and gathering furniture and teaching English and so on and so on. So I think at its core, any synagogue community is about living a life of mitzvot and doing so with partners who can inspire and instruct and clarify for us how to do it. Yes, of course, you can make Shabbos for yourself, but it's not as joyful. It's not as delicious. It's not as uplifting as when you share Shabbat with others, as an
I
example.
love what you said about relationships too, because I think, for many of us, faith communities are places where, if you're a shul goer, if you are a person who is like a weekly shul goer, it's a place where everyone knows your name, right? And you can't get that when you attend a synagogue, in New York City or somewhere else from your computer. That relational piece of belonging, and of having people who notice when you're not there, and want to help you if you are suffering. I think the piece about chesed, right, about the care that we can show to each other. That it's one thing to experience a prayer service, like a set period of time where you're hearing prayers, and it's another to feel like people will have my back. I have a baby, if I get sick, whatever it is. And I don't think that translates, when it's not your local community. And I think what you said also, Rabbi Spolansky, about the shared values, being able to act on shared values. I'm wondering if anybody wants to jump in, and then we'll move on to our next question. But do you all have thoughts on that piece? Like, what's the point of having a local Jewish community if you can attend services anywhere? Yeah, Lee.
I really felt that, coming back to the physical synagogue was so uplifting in a way I hadn't even really expected, because I've been going to services regularly online. But I no longer felt so isolated, and it's made a huge difference to actually be there in person and, have a role to play. Because I think, so much has been expected of the clergy during the pandemic, and, people still participate with Aliyot and so on, but I don't know, I just felt that the personal was really significant. And I don't think just for me, also, life cycle events have been shrunk to something very small. And now we have the opportunity for more people to attend, whether it's a bar mitzvah or, a wedding or a funeral. I just think that kind of support of the community means a lot. And we've been missing that. So I don't think you can do that same thing online. I think we have to be there in person, show up in person.
Yeah, there's an extra ingredient I think we all became extremely aware of, which is like the kiddush schmooze, or like the breaking bread after a funeral or a baby naming. That did a lot of heavy lifting that we maybe didn't realize. It felt like, oh yeah, that's the after party or something. It turns out it's essential. It's essential to that celebration. Yeah, Yvonne, and then last. Oh yeah, sorry, Rabbi Spolansky.
I just want to add to Lee's point about the village, right? I think, that line about it takes a village to raise a child. For families with children during pandemic, they became so aware of that. If they didn't already know it, now they know they need a village. And I think a synagogue community can be that village in a way that folks weren't even aware of. It's such a gift to have partners and role models to help raise our children. We need that.
I love that. Yvonne, and then Les.
I attended a ton of services at a New York synagogue online over COVID every Friday. And for me, it's a question of not apples or oranges, but apples and oranges, because there are things that you can get out of being part of, I was born in New York, and there was something really moving for me to be virtually in the space of a New York synagogue. But moving forward, I would like to think that there's room for both, that synagogues that, in bringing people back into the space, which I agree is very important to have the personal relationships, should also reach out to people who have maybe left the Toronto area, for instance, and want to connect, so that like it can be a dynamic model that we, that the benefits from this experience of the incredible access that Zoom provided shouldn't be lost. So there's so many people who have a hard time mobilizing and getting somewhere on a given occasion, and that we should like get videos in the synagogues and blast it so that those barriers of access are erased, and that we capture all of the ease that COVID taught us about through our technologies.
I love that. Les.
I think there are a lot of people who attended services, so to speak, that didn't before. And so I think there's two groups of people that I think we need to look at from the synagogue. One is the people who are going to come back. And I think a lot of people will. I think what Elise said is right. The physical presence of being in the synagogue is a different, feeling than sitting in your pajamas and watching services. But there are also, I think, but a lot of people who clicked into services who didn't come physically, and I think we need to think about how do we keep them, once everything is it comes back to whatever normal is. How do we keep them engaged, right? Because I think they were engaged, whether they were in our city or whether were in another city. I think that the online component is going to be very important, and we're going to have to think about how do we engage people who are online, because the people who come in person we're going to be there. You're going to be engaged. But
right.
the statistics you quoted, a very small percentage of people come to synagogue every week, or even on a regular basis. So it's really the others, right? The other people that we've got to think of. We have a tool now to engage them, and how do we do that? Especially since they're going to have all these other things going on outside of the home, and it's going to be sort of drawn in. We had a bit of a captive audience for the last little while.
Yeah.
We don't have that. We don't have that anymore.
Thanks, Les. Paula, and then Linda, and then we're going to just move on to the next question and invite your comments again after the next question. Yeah, Paula, and then Linda.
I think there's actually three aspects of this. If I attend virtually on Shabbat, any synagogue, I'm really just an observer. I'm not sure that I have, even if I come to my synagogue, I'm not really sure there is a lot of connection. I'm just sitting there watching a show, and I'm not being able to really hear those voices around me, which yesterday was amazing when we had our service, and we were there, and it just had an amazing feeling. Zoom, on the other hand, during the pandemic became another aspect, because at Shachrit and Mariv, Zoom, we all saw each other. We may not have heard each other, but then afterwards we sat and had our coffee and bagel, that we wouldn't have had at Shachrit. But when I look at who's there at Shachrit, this is not a population who ever attended Shachrit on a regular basis. These are people who have this, during the pandemic, have connected with us on Shachrit or Mariv, which is and are saying, let's not lose this. I need this. I can't drive in the morning and get to synagogue. So there's that aspect. I think the Zoom aspect kept the connection. A live stream is a movie.
Yeah. Thanks, Paula. Linda, and then we'll change subjects a little and invite more conversation.
We spoke about community in terms of seeing people at services, seeing people at the Kiddush, maybe doing some social justice together. I think we have the opportunity, and this builds on what Les says, to use the technology to create more communities or sub-communities. So at my congregation, we were, as soon as the pandemic started, we started cohort-based groups, and I am in one that ended up with about 15 people or so, and we met every week clockwork, and it was really important at the beginning of the pandemic. And we also shared there'd be a question for people to answer. And so we got personal too, which was great.
So
I
I'm
love
curious,
that.
were those groups put together based on what? Was there?
So I was in the group called Empty Nesters and Working Adults, for example. There was one for retired.
Life stage.
Mostly life stage, yeah. But if you had wanted to start another one on something, they would have.
Yeah, terrific. So that brings us to the next question, which is about how the pandemic has impacted synagogue's ability to evolve or change. So I think it's been a push and a pull in both directions. On the one hand, using Linda's example, we've become more creative, right? At Holy Blossom, we always had on the wish list to be able to live stream services, and it never floated to the top because there was always something else that needed our attention and our dollars. But wouldn't you know it, exactly 2 years ago, when we went into lockdown, somehow, lo and behold, we figured it out, right? It was forced to the top of the priority list. So I think in some ways, synagogues have become more creative and more innovative. And I also see that synagogue leadership, not only rabbis, but lay partners as well, and leading volunteers are tired. And in order to be creative and to feel you can channel that adrenaline in new directions, you need energy. And after 2 years, I also see there's real weariness. It used to be we put out a call for volunteers and they would come out of the woodwork like that. And now it takes a few asks, before the yeses come. So I just wonder how long it will be before that energy returns so that we can push forward with new creativity and readiness, willingness to evolve and change.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because it's sort of, the weariness comes from a lot of different things. One of the things I think it comes from is not being able to do things the way we've always done them. It takes a lot of energy to recreate everything we've ever done. And I see both the way that has exhausted a lot of us, and also the way that has given us a bit of a clean slate. So often, I've worked for a number of synagogues and Jewish institutions, and I understand many of you maybe are volunteers and lay leaders that, let's just do it the same way we did it last year. It's not a bad choice, right? Like it worked before, let's do it again. And for the last 2 years, there is no do it that way. There's no precedent, right? What I see, I teach innovation and to Jewish communities across North America as part of my job. And, a lot of the work that I do in the training is inviting people to say, we don't have to do it the way we've always done it. And what are some processes by which we can design what comes next? And I think, when I first started doing this right before the pandemic, it was like I had to translate that. What does that exactly mean? But we've all been, Silicon Valley startup founders in the last 2 years. In other words, we've all totally recreated something that used to be familiar. And having experienced that, I hope that one of the outcomes is that we all are more willing to try something new, to do something in a really different way, partially because we were forced to do that. But I'm hoping that actually that can kind of loosen our grip on the past, holding on to that because it worked fine, and working fine sometimes has gotten in the way of us making something different that might work really, really well, like better than fine. And that trade-off of, changing something that's working just fine. We don't want it to tank, right? We don't want it to fail. And yet also there might be something out there that if we shifted the way we're looking at it, if we did something differently, it would actually bring in a totally new kind of energy and people. So that's one of the things I've noticed is there's an understanding of needing to change things very quickly. And maybe we can carry that into the future and say, like, now we don't have to do it the way we're not, I don't think we should just go back to the way we were doing things 3 years ago. I'm hopeful that maybe everything getting just tossed in the air, although it was very traumatic and very difficult and very hard to do, gives us an opportunity to say, I think we could do something different. We could continue to do something different. We could continue to ask, is this serving us well? Or is it not, right? With synagogues closed and virtual services, it did mean more people had access. Folks who are homebound, folks who are in more isolated geographies, right? That there are benefits that have come out. Or just learning that you can actually make some connections. Linda, in your case, the small groups piece, right? We're talking about the limits of attending services virtually, but also there are totally other forms that we maybe didn't have. So those are some things that I've been noticing, that have actually maybe helped contribute to synagogues' ability to adapt and change to new realities moving forward. I think a final thing I'll note is I feel like it became harder for us to do light entertainment, by which I mean, and I just, I love a good, examination of Menachem Begin's speeches, right? But sometimes some of the things we might have done for, let's say, adult education would seem tone deaf when, in a pandemic when everyone is really suffering. And to some degree, a lot of us shifted to talking about really deep issues, spiritual questions. I think people are asking existential questions about the meaning of life. And I think that this allowed us the opportunity to go there a little more because we feel the way that everyone is asking those questions.
I saw that Ron Hoffman had his hand up before. I wonder if this is a good time for you to jump in, Ron.
Well, I think that there's been a number of good ideas, recognizing the creativity that we have to bring to the question. But given the trends that existed prior to the pandemic, there's this big overarching issue, which is that synagogues, as they have presented themselves, have been less important in the lives of our communities. So the question that I think needs to be examined is, how do you make the synagogue something other than what it has been in the past? How does it become more of a meaningful community to the people that it reaches out to and that it serves? I think that's the fundamental challenge, because if we don't address that, the trend is likely to continue. We have to, I think, change the way we present a synagogue to our population.
Ron just asked our third question in his own words. So I really appreciate what you said in that. One of the things I noticed is, during the pandemic, that congregations that were already doing really robust chesed work, the having a lot of relationships among congregants and not just between congregants and leadership, the kind of congregation that brings you food, when you are sick or when you're homebound, that those congregations that already had a robust chesed network activated that, right? And the closure of the building and the not being able to have services, or once people got online, having just virtual services, it didn't sort of decimate the community, right? There were other congregations, though, who maybe discovered when they looked in the mirror that they were in the performance business instead of the community business, and that without the weekly performance, and I say that, tefillah is a huge part of my life and something that I lead as a rabbi, but that, without the 9:30 a.m. showtime, they might not have as much left. And I couldn't agree with you more, Ron, that, for me, when I look at the future of synagogue, I am most interested in the pieces around how do we make robust, caring communities? How do we make those, synagogue a place where you make relationships, where you feel cared for and loved, and that is not necessarily what every synagogue, I mean, sure, every synagogue, is set up to care for people, but some of them have dug into that a lot more than others. And I'm excited to see now that, let's say, it became painfully obvious to all of us, we are all suffering, we are all in need. It became harder to pretend, right? You can't pretend you're okay for 2 years. And so I'm really excited, in the same vein as you were saying, Ron, to see how might we dig into those components that have always been a huge part of what Jewish communal life is supposed to be. And for the communities that looked around when everything closed and said, oh no, like, what do we do now, to kick that into gear as well? Yeah, Paula and then Lee.
I was out walking with some of our congregants that have created during this pandemic a walking group. And one of the conversations we had was, where are our children's generation participation? And these are kids who grew up in family services and grew up within the congregation with active parents and all of that. And they're looking and saying, I don't see it. I don't see that there are the whatever the synagogue is offering isn't speaking to them. And how do we start looking? And I think, some of those where that generation is, we have to incorporate in some way. There are attempts to have, younger, groups, but there has to be some way of bringing them in a different way. In other words, what met our needs doesn't seem to be meeting that generation's needs. And I don't know how, I don't have the answers, but I know that's where we have to be going.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. There's a lot of interesting research. I won't get into too much of it. This is, a particular interest of mine. But I think the bigger piece is that I think all of this change, that synagogues have been forced to do over the last 2 years, I'm hopeful that synagogues can also apply that to the question, Paula, that you're raising, which is that we can't just advertise harder for a different generation to come and be part of something that is simply not relevant or meaningful for their lives, that the community has to change to incorporate their values and their lives and the things that they need the most. And I wonder if synagogue communities may be more open to that component as well, having experienced this rapid change and experimentation. Maybe that destabilization will be good for younger generations too, to be able to say, okay, and what about this group? Well, how do we change who we've been in positive ways, to really incorporate their needs as well. Lee, and I know Rabbi Splansky, you always have an invitation to join in, but I'm sort of taking the facilitation because I know you're pinch hitting here and haven't looked as much at the material. Yeah, Lee.
Thank you. Well, that brings me to sort of think about two aspects. One is, the need for smaller groups that we've talked about, caring groups that may be, aligned in life stage or some other demographic, and then collaboration. I don't know, but I expect that, rabbis have felt pretty alone, and clergy and synagogues have felt such a struggle to create programming on the fly, to put services together, this constant need to do something innovative and new, and also just respond in the moment to what has been going on during the pandemic. And I think this gives us an opportunity to look at how we can collaborate among synagogues, within the Jewish community, to collaborate more, to bring effective experiences to people that don't substitute for that close feeling of the village, but also bring some kind of greater, Jewish identity to people who may not want the synagogue to be their village, but they want the synagogue to be something that that feeds them, and to see the Jewish community working together. That kind of isolation has taught us that we need to work together.
Mm. Yeah, Lee, I've seen so many collaborations, right? Especially when things go virtual, you can offer something jointly much easier. And the question I'm hearing you ask is like, well, how might that benefit all of us in the future, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person? But if there's a sense of even gentle territorial, like, right, that could we shift that? How might that actually help us reach more people, or be richer in people's lives? It's a really interesting question.
This conversation reminds me of something I said, I don't know, maybe a month ago, one Shabbat evening. So for the Holy Blossomite who are with us here, forgive me if you've heard this before. A lot of rabbis around North America for a year now have been talking about Yavna and about when the temple was destroyed. That should have been the end of Judaism altogether. But if it weren't for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his disciples, because of their innovation, their willingness to say, without the temple and its sacrificial system, now we have to do something altogether new. And then Rabbinic Judaism was born. And that's the Judaism that all Jews on the planet today of all stripes practice to one degree or another. And personally, I feel that's the wrong metaphor. I actually don't think this is the 9th of Av. I don't think this is destruction of everything that once was, and that the next Judaism post-pandemic is altogether different in every way. I really think it's a false metaphor, and it's a misleading metaphor. And Ron, to your point about what's going to be new about synagogues, the model that I look to instead of Yavna and Yochanan ben Zakkai is Usha. So fast forward 140 years, and there was another reemergence of people coming out of lockdown and their hiding places under Rome. And what happened in the Galilee, in the town of Usha, was rabbis convened and they put out a call across all of Israel saying, if you are not yet schooled in Torah, then come and join us and learn. And if you are learned in Torah, then come and join us and teach. And I think that needs to be the model now, where we say to every Jew, whatever is your Jewish heart song, if it's knitting blankets for Jewish babies born into the congregation, or if it is leading a refugee relief initiative, or if it is serving delicious coffee at the Oneg Shabbat, whatever is your capacity to give, to lead, to offer, and to create Jewish communal life and Jewish memories, we need you. Like, now is your time to step forward. And it's not only about Torah learning, right? And those of you who are not yet schooled in Jewish life, come and check it out. I think Paula's point about young people who now may have a hunch that Judaism has something to offer in a very real way that they didn't know before. I think we need to capture that hunch, to leverage the moment and say, give it a chance, give it a try. What's the worst thing that could happen? What do you really have to lose? So when we, for example, offered during pandemic, a 6-part, 8-part course on for emerging Jewish leaders, it didn't say we didn't teach how to be a Jewish leader at the synagogue. We taught how to lead in your workplace using Jewish values, right? How to be a leader in your circle of family and friends using Jewish values. So it was not the expected, come on, we'll put you on a committee. We hope that will come later. But I think the message, it's a dual message. Those who have something to teach, come and teach. Those who have something to learn, don't be afraid to come and learn. And we've all got something to learn.
Yeah. Well, we only have a couple more minutes. So I want to offer just some closing thoughts that, I think that there's both what is the future of synagogue? What are the things that we will keep? Some of them that we've talked about today, that even, some of you surfaced, the virtual access actually is helpful to so many people. And the relational piece became so important. The caring piece, the relational piece, even Liam, even the value of schmoozing, the value of being together, that those are things that really make an impact on people's lives. I think that there are some things that we need to go through, like that this is a transition process out, God willing, out of pandemic. We have to navigate it. It's not just like turning lights back on. So some of the things that, I think we will encounter is, what might it look like for synagogue communities to do some of the job that needs done for people, which is reconnecting those relational ties. Many of us have retreated to maybe having like 4 friends and a couple relatives that we have really spent most of our relational time with, and we've lost that acquaintance level of people in our lives. I'm wondering what it might look like if, as synagogue communities, we did some of that work with people, helping to reconnect those ties. Just because you now have Kiddush again doesn't mean people now can re-embrace. Like, we don't know how to do that necessarily. Cannot be a part of what synagogues offer. I think there's also just a lot of grief that we had to grieve in private, a lot of grief that we had to carry ourselves when usually we would carry it with community, the loss of loved ones, just the loss of our kids' childhoods, so many different layers of loss, and also grieving that things changed, right? That is a real thing, that change isn't always experienced as a good thing. It's a lot of grieving the imagined future we thought we would have, the life cycle events we had planned for that we had to have only 5 people at, right? All of those pieces. And I'm thinking about how might synagogues be able to help us all through that grief, through that transition time. And then finally, I see a lot of us re-examining the values we live our lives by. What is the meaning of my life? How do I embrace a meaningful way of living? And I think that our synagogue communities can help us ask a lot of those big questions. And then finally, I see a real need just for forgiveness. Forgive ourselves the ways that we didn't, live up to some imagined version of what we might do in a crisis. I'm a parent of young kids, forgive myself for being a failure of a parent, even though I was trying my best and objectively did okay, I think. Forgive ourselves as friends, that we couldn't maintain every single friendship that was meaningful to us. We just couldn't do it. And then forgive each other and just say, I know you did your best. I did my best, and be able to start again. And I think that synagogues can have a role